sir. Welcome to our today's software engineering session. Very good morning to all respected members. In last session, we will discuss about the process assessment and improvement recording details. And that process assessment and improvement recording, we will discuss about the basics and words. What about the process assessment and how to defining the kind of software process assessment and what are the different categories which is involved in the software process assessment. Those categories regarding mainly we will discuss about the what about the self assessment and what about the second party assessment and what about the third party assessment. Probably we will call it as a self assessment is a first party assessment also, and including that what are the kinds of assessment options will be frequently available in the industry, and how the graphical representation of the assessment and improvement, how the software process especially has been examined by the software process assessment, and how the software process assessment leads to the software process improvement, and the software process assessment how it leads to the capability determination, and finally how the capability determination will be motivates to the SPI, call it as a software process improvements, and how these SPIs, we will call it as a software process improvements for identifies the what the modifications will be held especially for the software process. And coming to the major functionality of the capability determination, this capability determination identifies the kinds of capabilities and kinds of risks which is held inside the software process. This recording we will discuss about the assessment and improvement, and after completion the topic yesterday we will discuss about the process models, how these process models will help us for developing the software. And in these process models especially we are going to learn about the how to set the framework activities, and regarding these framework activities how to guide the particular software teams, and we will this topic we are going to learn about the uh, different kinds of process models. Maybe these process models as a linear process model, incremental process models, or evolutionary process models. Now these process models regarding yesterday's itself we will discuss about the waterfall model, and in waterfall model maximum we can refer it as a linear sequential model or a classical life cycle model. Yesterday's session we will clearly illustrate what about the waterfall model especially for the software development process. Means already you are aware a waterfall model always having the capability it can illustrates the software development process as a systematic or linear sequential flow manner. Yes. Now, what are the important phases? Entire waterfall model, there is a five important phases, means framework activities will be there. The first phase, we will call it as a requirement analysis and specification. Coming to the second phase, can be described as a design phase. After completion of the design phase, next we will move to the implementation and unit testing. After this phase, in fourth phase, we will learn about the integration and system testing. And finally, we are moving to the fifth phase activity, that is operations and maintenance phase. Now, what about the sequential flow will be held in the waterfall model? These things we will discuss about the last session. Now, whether we are going to discussing about the advantages of the waterfall model. One thing we should remember, whether we are going to discussing about the advantages of the waterfall model, first of all we will say this waterfall model is very simple. At what kind of aspect? This model is very simple to implement, and also it is supported number of resources, which resources are required as a minimal manner. Are you getting? Now, another advantage, the starting point and ending point of the each phase presenting in the waterfall model has been fixed. Now, by every phase has been fixed means it gives the flexibility to make the things very easy, means which makes it easy to cover the entire progress. Now, another major advantage of the waterfall model, what about the release date for the complete product? Means it will be completely depends upon the time schedule, and also what about the final cost of the product? These two things specifically we can determine before the development. Okay, these are all the different advantages of the waterfall model. Next, coming to the what are the disadvantages of the waterfall model? One thing we should remember, we cannot accommodate any kind of changing requirements. Here we are having the higher amount of risks and uncertainty. Are you getting? Now, these are all the major disadvantages of the waterfall model. Waterfall model. Waterfall model. Waterfall model. Next, coming to the another process model. Now, we are going to discussing about the incremental model. Now, what about the incremental model? One thing we should remember, whether we are going to discussing about the incremental model, it is a kind of process of software development. Especially in incremental model, where we are going to collecting the entire requirements, those requirements divided into multiple standalone modules, especially for the SDC, which we can call it as a software development cycle. In this incremental model, each module goes through the requirements, design, implementation and testing phases. Remember, whether we are going to discussing about the incremental model, each module of the incremental model goes through the requirements, design, implementation and testing phases. Remember, this step is most important step. Now coming to the incremental model, one thing we should remember, the process of the incremental model, always the process should be continuous until the when the complete system has been achieved. Now look at the diagram. Here we are having the requirements. Now coming to the first phase of the increment, which we can call it as the build one. Here we are going to deal with the design and development, testing and implementation. Coming to the another module of the incremental model, module 2, say the requirements. After requirements, we are moving to the design and development. Once this particular phase of the module has been completed, next it moves to the testing. Next it moves to the implementation. And like that manner, the incremental model process will be done. Now, what are the, in last we will discuss about the, there is a different phases held especially for the incremental model. Now the first one is the requirement analysis. In requirement analysis, simply you can say this is the first phase of the incremental model. In this phase, we are going to analyze the product. When the product has been analyzed, then only we will expertise for identifying the requirements, exact requirements. Now another thing, whether we are going to discussing about the requirement analysis, here for identifying the requirements, and what about the system functional requirements. Those system functional requirements has been understood by the analysis team of the requirements, means which team has been taking the responsibility for product analysis. That team will be taken about this step. Whether we are going to discussing about the develop, for develop the software under this model, which we can call it as an incremental model, the primary phase, which we can call it as the first phase of the incremental model, requirement analysis, performs a major crucial role. Next, coming to the another phase of the incremental model, that is the design and development. Specifically, this particular phase of the incremental model, which is held the software development life cycle, here entire the design of the system, means the system overall functionality, which help us for developing the kinds of methods. Those methods has been finished as a successful manner. Are you? Yes, success. When we should remember, when the software develops a new practicality, especially the incremental model uses the style and development phase. Next, coming to the third phase, that is testing. In incremental model, whether we are going to discussing about this particular phase, which we can call it as a testing phase, this testing phase having the capability, it can check the whole performance of each and every existing function as well as additional functionality. This particular testing phase, we are using the various methods. These entire methods are especially used for testing the behavior of a particular task. Are you getting? Next, we are moving to the another phase, that is implementation phase. Remember, whether we are going to discussing about the implementation phase, only this phase in entire incremental model having the capability, it can enable the coding phase of the development system. Means this particular phase where it can be involves. This implementation phase involves the final coding, that the design and designing and development phase, and also test the functionalities in the testing phase. After successfully completion of the implementation phase, the number of products working is enhanced and upgraded up to the final deliverable product, final system product. It is about the implementation phase. Now coming to the incremental model. Now, what are the advantages of the incremental model? Remember, when we are going to comparing this model to the remaining process models, here we are spending very less cost. In this particular model, we are having the flexibility. We can identify the errors in that product. Here, the software has been generated as a quickest manner during the software life cycle. Now we are having the scope. There is a very less expensive for changing the requirements. These are all the major advantages of the incremental model. Now there is some disadvantages of this model also will be there. Here we are going to discussing about the each and every iteration phase is rigid and does not overlap to each other. Once we are going to rectifying a problem in one unit, it requires the corrections. What are all the remaining units presenting on that model? For the sake here, it will consume say very huge time. That is the major disadvantage of the incremental model. Next, after successfully completion of the incremental model, next we are moving to the evolutionary process model. Now, whether we are going to discussing about the evolutionary process model, the evolutionary model is completely entirely based on the concept of making an initial product and then evolving the software product at overall time with the help of iterative and incremental approaches. incremental approaches with a proper feedback. Proper feedback. In this type of model, especially the product go through the several iterations and finally it make up the final product to build, which helps us the multiple iterations. Here the development is carried out simultaneously with the help of feedback, which is collecting especially for the development phase. Development phase, remember, this is one of the key point. The development in this particular evolutionary process model is carried out simultaneously with the help of collecting the feedback. This collection of feedback, which it will be held during the development time. Development time. Now, look at this diagram. This is a perfect evolutionary model pictorial representation. Now there is a specifications will be there is a development and there is a validation. Once the specification will be linked to the development and the development has been linked to the validation, and when the time of validation we are moving to the development and specification. Specification always we are going to talk about the what about the initial stage, initial versions. Development means it will be held as a intermediate versions. Validation means we are expecting the final version of the product. After successfully completion of the validation, we are expecting the final version and a successful version of the product. Now, there is a whether we are going to discussing about the EPM, which we can call it as a evolutionary process models. In these evolutionary process models, importantly it can be categorized into three models. The first one is the iterative model, incremental model and spiral model. Remember, these three categories comes under the evolutionary process models. Now we are going to discussing about the iterative model as a first. Here what we are going to do in this model. In this model we are going to collecting the initial requirements, then we are moving to the how to enhance the product over multiple iterations until when the final products get ready. Remember, every iteration must ensure there is a modifications will be held in the design. These design modifications were made and some changes in the when the functional requirements is added. When the functional requirements is added. Yes, already this diagram already we will discuss. Next, coming to the incremental model. First we will discuss about the iterative model under the EPM, evolutionary process models. Next we are moving to the incremental model. In this incremental model, firstly we are going to build the project with the basic features and then it will be evolve the project in every iteration. This kind of model becomes a popular or mainly used especially for the large scale projects. Remember, this incremental model has been majorly used especially for the large scale projects. Here in incremental model, what about the first step? Here the first step is to collecting the requirements After completion of the requirements, then we are going to performing the analysis. Means we are take it as a requirements analysis in one phase, first step, and the second step we are moving to the design. The third step of the incremental model we are moving to the code, and final step we are moving to the testing phase. Remember, these four steps are most important steps whether we are going to discussing about the incremental model: analysis, design, code, and test. Coming to the iterative model, here we are having the three steps: design and development, testing and implementation. Are you getting? From here, incremental model, analysis, design, code and test. Remember, the major step of the incremental model, we are going to gathering or collecting the requirements, and then we are performing the analysis. After completion of this step, first step, next we are moving to the design. After completion of the second step, we are moving to the code. After completion of the third step, we are moving to the test. And this whole process goes down the same over and over again until when our final project has been ready. And these things has been repeated up to when? Up to when the final project has been ready. Next, coming to the under EPM, after successfully discussion of the iterative model and incremental model, next we are moving to the spiral model. Remember, whether we are going to discussing about the spiral model, one thing we should remember, the spiral model is a combination of the waterfall model and iterative model. Remember, the spiral model is a combination of the waterfall model and iterative model. Iterative model means we are having the design and development, testing, implementation. Here, in this particular model, we are going to handling, means in this particular model, we are especially focused on the how the risks has been handling along with the developing phase of the project with the incremental and iterative approach. And by discussing about this model, producing the output quickly as well as it is good for big projects. Means what I am saying, whether we are going to discussing about the spiral model, a spiral model is a combination of waterfall model and iterative model, and especially in this model we are putting efforts, we can focus on risk handling. This kind of risk handling along with the developing phase of the project with the incremental and iterative approach. Here, once the software has been created through multiple iterations using a spiral approach. Here, what are the different phases will be there? In spiral model, importantly, we are going to discussing about the 4 phases. The first one is determination of the object and how we are going to identifying the alternative solutions. Coming to the second one, identifying the risks and resolving the risks. And the third one is and how to develop the another versions of the product. The fourth one is how we are going to review and plan for the next phase. That is about the spiral model. Next, coming to the advantages of the evolutionary process models. One major advantage, simply we can discuss about the EPM, evolutionary process models. It is a very much suitable for solving the big complex projects. Now in EPM we are having the advantage, after completion of the every iteration, which risks has been presenting, those risks has been analyzed very easiest manner in every iteration. Now what are the disadvantages of the EPM means? It is not fit for the small projects. Why? Because entire the complexity of the spiral model can be more when compared to the other sequential models. That is about the EPM. Okay. In this session, clearly we will discuss about the kinds of process models regarding. We will discuss about the incremental model in today's session, and what is the pictorial representation of the incremental model, and what are the important phases has been presenting in the incremental model, and what are the advantages of the incremental model, and what are the disadvantages of the incremental model. And after completion of the incremental model, next we will discuss about the evolutionary process models, and what about the diagrammatical approach of the evolutionary process model, and what are the important phases, and those each and every phase regarding responsibility we will discuss in evolutionary model. And along with that we will discuss about the different kinds of EPMs, evolutionary process models, and finally we will discuss about the advantages of the EPM and disadvantages of the EPM. Okay. By coming tomorrow's session, we will discuss about the CDM, which we can call it as a concurrent development models and concurrent models. Okay. Thank you for attending this today's session.